gospel superstar Charles Jenkins. Yes, the same Charles Jenkins who gave us This Means War has just dropped an R&B single, and the church world is in complete shock. Some are calling it bold and groundbreaking, while others say it's a dangerous compromise. But here's the real question. Has Pastor Jenkins crossed the line, or is he simply breaking barriers the church has been too afraid to face? Stick with me, because what I'm about to reveal will change the way you see this entire controversy. Charles Jenkins has always been known as a trailblazer in gospel music, a pastor and songwriter who shook the church with powerful anthems that crossed generational lines. But now, with his latest R&B single, the entire conversation around him has shifted. Some church members are asking, why would a gospel pastor step into R&B? Others are praising him for being authentic and fearless, stepping outside traditional boxes to reach a wider audience. In today's video, we're diving deep into the story behind this bold move. What inspired Charles Jenkins to release an R&B track at this point in his career? How are pastors, church leaders, and fans reacting? And most importantly, what does this mean for the future of gospel music as a whole? Stay tuned, because we've uncovered surprising details about how the single was made, the backlash it sparked online, and the hidden message behind the lyrics that most people completely missed. Trust me, you don't want to miss what comes next. Before we talk about controversy, let's rewind and remember exactly who Charles Jenkins is and why his name carries so much weight in the church and gospel music world. Charles Jenkins isn't just another gospel artist. He's a pastor, a leader, and one of the most recognized figures in modern gospel music. Born and raised in Chicago, Jenkins grew up surrounded by the rich traditions of Black church culture. By the time he stepped onto the national stage, he wasn't just making music. He was making anthems that resonated across sanctuaries, stadiums, and radio airwaves. His breakout moment came in 2012 with the smash hit, This Means War. If you've been in church any time over the last decade, chances are you've heard this song shouted, clapped, and sung with passion by choirs and congregations across the world. That single became more than music. It was a spiritual declaration. It solidified Jenkins as a powerhouse who could merge timeless church energy with modern production, making gospel relevant for younger audiences without alienating the older generation. But Charles Jenkins wasn't just about music. He was, and still is, a pastor deeply involved in his community. As the senior pastor of Fellowship Missionary Baptist Church in Chicago, he inherited the pulpit from Reverend Clay Evans, one of the city's most legendary faith leaders. That meant he wasn't only carrying the weight of a congregation, but also the responsibility of a historic church known for its influence in civil rights, gospel music, and community leadership. For years, Jenkins managed to balance both roles, leading a flock as a pastor and leading the charts as an artist. His music inspired, uplifted, and gave people hope, all while reinforcing his role as a man of God. That's why when news broke that he had released an R&B single, many people were stunned. The reaction wasn't just about the music, it was about the man behind it. Because for so many, Charles Jenkins wasn't supposed to be an entertainer. He was supposed to be a pastor. And in church culture, those lines have always been drawn sharply. But Jenkins just blurred them. And here's where the tension begins to rise. His fans and church supporters are now divided. Some believe he's stepping into dangerous territory, while others argue he's finally freeing himself from outdated restrictions. But here's the shocking part. They're not just arguing about the music. They're arguing about whether a pastor can represent both the pulpit and the stage in a genre often associated with love, heartbreak, and sensuality. We'll get into those fiery reactions in just a moment. But first, let's unpack why Charles Jenkins chose this path now, after years of being celebrated as a gospel-only voice. To truly understand why Charles Jenkins would make such a bold pivot, we have to look at the bigger picture. This isn't just about one man making a song, it's about timing, culture, and the shifting landscape of music and ministry. For years, Charles Jenkins has stood at the crossroads of tradition and innovation. His gospel hits like This Means War and Awesome were more than songs. They were movements. They connected deeply with the church, but also resonated outside it. That crossover appeal has always been a part of Jenkins' gift, but he never fully leaned into it, until now. So why R&B? Why now? First, let's be honest. R&B has always had deep roots in the Black church. Many of the greatest R&B legends, from Aretha Franklin to Sam Cooke, first trained their voices in gospel choirs. The vocal runs, the emotional delivery, even the themes of love and struggle, they're all born out of the same soil. For Jenkins, this new single may not be as much of a departure as people think. In fact, it might be a full circle moment. Second, the gospel industry itself has been changing. In recent years, artists like Ty Tribbett, Mali Music, and even Kirk Franklin have pushed the boundaries of what gospel sounds like. Jenkins may be responding to that wave, realizing that the message doesn't always have to be locked inside a single genre. Music is universal, and maybe he wanted to tell a story that gospel's framework just couldn't hold. But here's the more personal side of it. Insiders close to Jenkins say this project wasn't about abandoning gospel. It was about expressing another layer of his humanity. As a pastor, he's often placed on a pedestal, expected to only speak about God, faith, and spirituality. But like anyone else, Jenkins experiences love, heartbreak, joy, and vulnerability. R&B gave him the space to explore those themes honestly, without the weight of church expectations. Of course, that's exactly what stirred the controversy. When people heard his voice over R&B melodies, lyrics that weren't strictly about faith, some felt betrayed. They asked, how can a pastor sing about romance and still preach on Sunday? Others, however, defended him passionately, pointing out that pastors are human too, and expressing emotions through music doesn't erase their calling. There's also a strategic angle here. Releasing an R&B single right now isn't just about personal expression. It's also about expanding influence. The lines between gospel and mainstream music are thinner than ever. Social media, streaming platforms, and viral trends have made it possible for a song to reach millions outside church walls in just days. Jenkins may have realized that an R&B single could introduce him to a whole new audience, one that gospel alone might not have reached. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Some fans suspect the timing wasn't random at all. With conversations in the church already heated about blending secular and sacred music, Jenkins may have intentionally released this single to spark dialogue, to challenge the church to rethink its rigid boundaries. But whether it was strategy, expression, or both, one thing is clear: the reaction has been explosive. And in just a moment, we're going to break down the church's divided response. Because trust me, the comments, the sermons, and the social media threads are where things really get messy. When Charles Jenkins' R&B single dropped, it didn't take long before the church world erupted with opinions. Within hours of the release, social media was buzzing. Twitter threads, Facebook debates, Instagram reels, and even TikTok duets started dissecting the song line by line. And just like that, Jenkins' new track became less of a song release and more of a cultural earthquake. On one side, you had church members who felt shocked and even betrayed. For them, Charles Jenkins wasn't just a singer. He was a spiritual leader, a pastor entrusted with guiding souls. They questioned how someone with such a sacred responsibility could sing about romantic love, relationships, or human emotions in a way that didn't explicitly point back to God. Some critics went as far as to call it a slippery slope, warning that if pastors blurred the line between gospel and R&B, the church would lose its distinction from the world. These voices weren't just random social media commenters either. A few pastors and church leaders across the country even addressed the issue from their pulpits. In one widely circulated clip, a preacher criticized Jenkins by saying, "When you're called to shepherd God's people, you don't get the luxury of double lives. You can't be holy on Sunday and sensual on Monday." That sermon clip alone sparked thousands of shares, further fueling the fire. But on the other side of the debate, Jenkins had a massive wave of defenders. Many fans argued that the backlash revealed a deeper problem in the church, an unwillingness to accept pastors as fully human. They pointed out that pastors fall in love, get married, experience heartbreak, and live life just like everyone else. So why should it be considered worldly if a pastor expresses those emotions in music? Supporters also emphasized the artistry behind Jenkins' work. They praised the single for its creativity, vocal strength, and lyrical honesty. Some even said it was refreshing to hear a pastor embrace vulnerability rather than hiding behind a polished, perfect image. For them, Jenkins wasn't compromising. He was breaking chains of unrealistic expectations. The generational divide became especially clear. Younger audiences, particularly millennials and Gen Z, leaned more toward defending Jenkins. They argued that faith and artistry don't have to exist in separate boxes, and that Jenkins was simply making music for real people, with real experiences. Older audiences, however, were far more hesitant, often citing tradition, holiness, and the role of the pulpit as reasons why Jenkins' move felt troubling. And then came the memes. Social media lit up with jokes, playful edits, and side-by-side comparisons of Jenkins' gospel hits versus his new R&B sound. While some were lighthearted, others used humor to make sharp critiques, mocking the idea of a pastor singing about romance. But here's the part most people missed. Not all church leaders were against him. In fact, some well-respected pastors came forward in defense of Jenkins. They reminded the public that music has always been diverse, and that labeling certain genres as ungodly is more cultural than biblical. One pastor even said, if David could write psalms about God one day and songs about grief and love the next, why can't Charles Jenkins? That perspective opened the door for deeper conversations about the limitations the church often places on its leaders. So the reaction was explosive, but it wasn't one-sided. The debate revealed a major tension that's been simmering in church culture for years. How much freedom do pastors and gospel artists really have when it comes to personal expression? And here's where things get even more dramatic. While the church was divided, the wider public, especially R&B fans, were discovering the song for the first time. Their reaction was completely different. And that's where we'll go next, the surprising reception outside the church that might change the entire direction of Charles Jenkins' career. While the church was busy debating whether Charles Jenkins had gone too far, something unexpected was happening outside the sanctuary. The mainstream audience, especially R&B listeners, were discovering Jenkins in an entirely new light. And their reaction was not only different, it was almost the opposite of what many in the church were saying. From the moment the single hit streaming platforms like Spotify, Apple Music, and YouTube, R&B fans started leaving comments that sounded more like praise than criticism. For many of them, Jenkins wasn't a pastor stepping out of bounds. He was a refreshing new voice in a genre that often gets criticized for lacking authenticity. His smooth vocals, emotional delivery, and polished production stood shoulder to shoulder with artists who've been in R&B for years. On Twitter, fans who had never even heard of Jenkins' gospel career were writing things like, "This guy is incredible. Where has he been hiding?" Others shared clips of the song with captions like, "When your pastor can out-sing your favorite R&B artist." That kind of reaction showed just how quickly perception can shift depending on who's listening. What's fascinating here is how the R&B community judged him solely on the quality of the music, not on the weight of his title as pastor. They didn't care about the pulpit, the sermons, or the traditional expectations of gospel. They just heard a man with undeniable talent delivering a heartfelt song. To them, the track wasn't controversial, it was just good music. This also opened up another layer of conversation. Some music critics began pointing out that Jenkins' transition wasn't as strange as it seemed. After all, many legendary artists, Sam Cooke, Aretha Franklin, Whitney Houston, started in gospel before stepping into R&B and pop. In fact, some argued that Jenkins was tapping into a long tradition of artists who carried church-rooted soul into mainstream spaces. The difference, of course, is that Jenkins is still an active pastor, which makes his case unique. But here's where it gets even more interesting. His crossover didn't just catch the attention of casual R&B fans, it also drew the eye of industry insiders. Word began spreading that some producers and labels were curious about whether Jenkins had more R&B material up his sleeve. Could this single be the beginning of a whole new chapter in his career, or was it just a one-time experiment? That question alone kept people talking, both inside and outside the church. Meanwhile, social media algorithms started doing what they do best, amplifying the conversation. Clips of Jenkins performing snippets of the song began circulating, and people who had no connection to church culture were being introduced to him for the first time. This raised another question. If Jenkins found major success in R&B, how would that impact his role as a pastor? Could he balance both worlds, or would one eventually overshadow the other? For Jenkins personally, this wider audience reception must have felt validating. While the church wrestled with whether his move was appropriate, the mainstream market was proving there was real demand for his sound. And in today's music industry, where streaming numbers often dictate influence, the public's support could carry just as much weight, if not more, than traditional church approval. But of course, the story doesn't end there. Because while fans and critics outside the church were celebrating his artistry, some people began digging deeper. They wanted to know, was this song just harmless expression, Or was there a hidden message in the lyrics that revealed more about where Jenkins truly stands? That investigation sparked even more speculation, and it's where the controversy takes an even sharper turn. When Charles Jenkins released his R&B single, most listeners initially focused on the shock factor, a pastor singing R&B, and either praised or criticized him based on that alone. But once the dust settled and people actually started listening closely to the lyrics, another wave of conversation emerged. Because the more you pay attention, the more it seems Jenkins may have been sending a message, one that goes beyond just love and relationships. Let's break it down. On the surface, the song comes across as a classic R&B ballad. It talks about love, intimacy, and vulnerability in a way that feels natural for the genre. There are lines about longing, connection, and the complexities of relationships. Nothing shocking there, at least not for an R&B song. But for a pastor, every word carries extra weight. People began dissecting the lyrics like a sermon, looking for deeper meaning. Some fans argue that the lyrics aren't just about romantic love, they're layered. They suggest that Jenkins intentionally crafted the song so that it could be heard two ways, as a traditional love song, but also as a metaphor for divine love, or even the struggles of maintaining faith in challenging seasons. In that sense, it would be a clever move, writing something that works both inside and outside the church without explicitly declaring it gospel. But not everyone agrees with that interpretation. Critics say that if the message was supposed to be spiritual, it was far too hidden. They argue that ambiguity is dangerous because it opens the door for misunderstanding. To them, Jenkins didn't write a double-layered gospel metaphor. He simply wrote an R&B song, plain and simple. And that, for them, is the problem. Still, the conversation around the hidden message won't die down. Some listeners point to certain key phrases in the song that sound almost like coded references to faith, such as longing for something greater, finding strength in connection, or overcoming personal battles. Whether or not those references were intentional, they've become talking points in countless comment sections. And then there's another angle entirely. A group of supporters believe Jenkins used the song as a way to challenge the church without ever saying it directly. In their view, the track is less about romance and more about freedom. The freedom to create, to express, and to live without the constant judgment of religious tradition. They argue that the very act of releasing the song, regardless of the lyrics, was Jenkins' true message. I don't have to fit into the box you built for me. That interpretation changes the whole conversation. If the song is read as an artistic statement rather than just a love ballad, then it becomes less about R&B and more about rebellion, or maybe even reform. Was Jenkins quietly telling the church that it's time to loosen its grip on creativity? Was he signaling a shift not just in his music, but in the entire way pastors and gospel artists engage with culture? This is why the lyrics became such a focal point. They aren't just words in a song. They're a mirror reflecting back people's assumptions about faith, leadership, and authenticity. For some, they reveal compromise. For others, they reveal courage. And here's where things get even more intriguing. People started speculating about what this means for Jenkins' future projects. Was this song just a test to gauge public reaction, or is it part of a larger body of work, a full R&B album that could permanently redefine his career? If the lyrics are any indication, Jenkins may be hinting at more than just one single. But while fans and critics continue to argue about hidden meanings, Jenkins himself has remained relatively quiet, letting the music speak for itself. That silence has only fueled speculation, leaving everyone asking the same question. What's next for Charles Jenkins?